Good evening to those members of the Hobart and William Smith and Geneva community that are gathered with us tonight. It's so wonderful to see a crowd like this in person. And it's fitting as we inaugurate a new series focused on global engagement that I can also extend a welcome to members of our wider family and alumni network who are joining us via live stream. So whether you're here or there, we're glad to have you with us for an evening that promises to be exciting and illuminating. HWS, as you know, has long been known among our peer institutions as a particularly outward-facing institution, where an astonishing 60% of students study abroad as part of their undergraduate experience, where the study of world languages is strongly embraced, where we both host and produce Fulbright Fellows each year, and where we continue to prepare our graduates to enact our shared values through service in the Peace Corps. In these ways and in many others, global engagement is very much a part of what we do at a foundational level. But we don't rest on those laurels. Recognizing HWS's existing strengths in this area, Hobart alumnus and former trustee James Anderton IV made a generous gift to the colleges last year to strengthen our engagement with issues of critical global significance and to create opportunities for our students and our faculty to have meaningful encounters with those individuals and ideas that shape our shared world. The Anderton Endowment has already this semester supported several faculty through a curricular development grant and will soon celebrate student achievement with an associated prize to be awarded at the upcoming Blackwell Hale dinner. Tonight, though, is the big event. The Anderton Forum for Global Engagement, where we will shortly be joined by former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. Tonight is special. It's the first in what will become an annual tradition on our campus. And it's special to me because I have the ability to call upon my friend and colleague, Professor Kristen Welsh, in her new role as acting director of the college's Institute for Global Studies, to introduce our special and most honored guest.
Thank you, Stacy. And let me add my own heartfelt welcome to all of you, both here in the Vandervoort room and connected via live stream. Ambassador Yovanovitch completed a 33-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, moving from early postings in Mogadishu, London, and Moscow to 3 appointments as U.S. Ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic, the Republic of Armenia, and to Ukraine. Today, Masha Yovanovitch is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a non-resident fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. As a career diplomat, Masha served outside the public spotlight and the latest news cycles. That situation changed dramatically at the end of her ambassadorship to Ukraine. While her memoir, Lessons from the Edge, addresses the end of her diplomatic career and her testimony in the first Trump impeachment hearings, it tells a much larger story, that of an immigrant family grateful to make its home in a democratic society, and that of a person who for decades worked to live the words of her oath of office, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Lessons from the Edge provides a window into the thought processes of a seasoned diplomat. Masha walks readers through moments when her own skills were questioned and moments when she had to balance with exquisite care the interests of competing groups. The memoir reveals a person whose clearly articulated code of ethics was developed through her own training, study, and experience, and above all, from the examples of beloved parents whose own histories, they survived both the Nazi and the Soviet terrors, demonstrate courage, perseverance, and unwavering integrity. I was struck by the way language represents a through line in this story. Masha was born in Montreal, where her parents spoke French as their common language. She communicated with her father in Russian and her mother in German. On arriving in Kent, Connecticut, preschooler Masha decided to speak only her new language, English. This story of language loss is one that many immigrant families know well. However, after graduating from Princeton, Masha was able to spend the summer of 1980 studying Russian at Moscow's Pushkin Institute, hoping to learn more about the Soviet Union and to connect with relatives of her maternal grandfather. This was a period of high tension between the superpowers. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, and President Carter had decided to boycott the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics. Against this backdrop, Masha sought out her great-aunt Vera. Eager to learn more about how this branch of her family had managed to live through the revolution, the famines, Stalin's purges, World War II, and more, Masha instead encountered silence. As she writes, Vera may have been small and hunched, but she was a survivor. She wasn't going to let a kid from the US get her into trouble with the authorities by discussing anything that could be considered sensitive, which was everything I wanted to know about. One of the most revealing stories in Lessons from the Edge centers on words and who gets to use them. Upon being nominated by the George W. Bush administration as US ambassador to Armenia, Masha had to weigh her excitement at this opportunity against what would be a heavy burden: the obligation to follow US policy that at the time refused to use the word genocide to describe the massacre and deportation of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire early in the 20th century. Her decision-making process clearly outlines the personal code of ethics I alluded to earlier. She writes that, "I had an obligation to my conscience and the Constitution. If an issue was so antithetical to both that I couldn't work within the system to change it, then I would have to resign." In the end, she accepted the nomination, helping the US work toward reconciliation between Turkey and Armenia. I will conclude with a few lines from the end of Lessons from the Edge. Masha writes, "History is a double-edged sword. The past can illuminate the future, but it can also burden us with traumas that limit our ability to adapt to the demands of that future. Ultimately, what we do with history's lessons is up to us. Do we throw up our hands, or do we get to work on fixing the problems?" Hobart and William Smith colleges take great pride in educating students who get to work fixing the problems. Our audience is filled with such students and alumni tonight, and I ask them and all of you to join me in welcoming HWS President Mark Gearan and Ambassador Marie Jovanovic.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. And Kristen, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And Stacy, thank you so much for all you've done to bring us together for the Androgen Forum. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, students, faculty. I should have been doing that for you.
That's okay. I got it.
Our Geneva neighbors, we're delighted to have all of you here. We were saying earlier, yesterday was International Women's Day. And of course, this month we celebrate Women's History Month. And in thinking of the ambassador's visit here, I was recalling previous women who've come to Hobart and William Smith, focused on international issues, women of note. Eleanor Roosevelt was here in 1947 to chair a conference the then president had planned. And Ambassador Wynant to the UK, who was a Princeton graduate, was a guest, and President Eddy, from a former Hobart William Smith president, who was Assistant Secretary of State. So Eleanor Roosevelt has been here. A week before 9/11, Madeleine Albright was on this campus, Secretary Albright, to receive the Elizabeth Blackwell Award, the statue we just walked by, recognizing a woman of note and distinction. And Secretary Hillary Clinton has been to our campus many times. So tonight, you fall into that line of women who've made a difference and women who've worked on the world stage in significant ways. So we warmly welcome you here and thank you for being here. I join with Kristen. This is a great read.
Thank you.
This book. It is. It reads in some ways like a novel or a spy novel or thriller. And then an important one. So I thought it would be fun to have some questions together.
Okay.
And then we have, I'm sure, better questions from the audience to have here. But let me, if I could, start with a bit, taking off from Professor Welch's great introduction, about you, because this is a memoir. And as an immigrant family coming here, you write very movingly about your parents. And they settled in the United States in Kent, Connecticut. You went to Kent School. We have many Hobart and William Smith alums through the years, having been educated there. But talk to us about that growing up and how that prepared you, because as language was a through line, so were your parents and your family. So as we get to know each other here in this format with our guests, speak to us about that growing up, that formation, and how that informed your life.
Yeah. So thank you for asking that question, because I wrote the book for many, many different reasons. But one of the important reasons was I wanted to honor my parents, who had sacrificed a lot. As I'm sure many people in this audience know, their parents have sacrificed for them, who sacrificed a lot by coming to the United States and creating the possibility of a meaningful future for my brother and myself. Being an American by choice is a little different, I think, from being born into that privilege, because you really have to think about it. My parents really thought about that, and they thought about the privilege of being an American citizen. Having grown up under totalitarian regimes, they knew what it was like not to be able to say what you wanted to say. They knew what it was like not to be able to worship the way you wanted to. They knew what it was like to be afraid. And so they really appreciated being in the United States and having the freedoms that I think, sometimes we take for granted here. And they taught my brother and I that we needed to really appreciate that, which I have to admit, along the years, I kind of started taking for granted as well, the freedoms that we all enjoy as Americans. But they taught us not to take it for granted. And they also said that we needed to give back, that we didn't have anything materially, but we were rich in what mattered, and we were in the United States, and that meant that we needed to give back in whatever way we chose. If we ended up working in a corporation, we needed to think about what that meant, being, a good citizen in the community, being a good mentor to people coming up, et cetera. It's more about how you do the work than what the particular field you choose is, and maybe it's something you do in your off hours, contributing to the community. So over the years, it's not like there was a straight and narrow path to government service for me at all. I took a lot of detours along the way. My senior year in college, I somehow missed the deadline for turning in my senior thesis. That was a major problem, by the way.
You don't recommend that, Ambassador?
Do not recommend that, yeah.
Take notes there.
Do not do this. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I ended up in New York City working in a marketing and advertising firm, which was great because it taught me a lot of skills that I didn't have and taught me things that I thought I wouldn't be good at. And in fact, I did have those skills in the end. And whatever you do along the way teaches you stuff, and you bring it along with you, and it enriches what you end up doing. But I decided that this was not the career for me. I wanted to marry up my passion for history and foreign policy and politics, along with travel and meeting people from foreign cultures, eating the food, learning the languages, et cetera. I wanted to marry that up with what I was actually doing from 9 to 5, because and this is something you should also take notes on. We spend a lot of our time at work, so it's really good to do something that you are passionate about. Because it just makes everything so much better. So I thought about the Foreign Service. It was something I had thought about in high school and then kind of drifted away from. And so I started the process of joining the foreign process, which is long and arduous and taught me that you also need to persist in life in order to get what you want. But that enabled me to marry up my interest passions with that desire to serve the American people. And it had the added benefit that I got paid to do it.
So that's so interesting. So you're a senior at Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
You miss your thesis deadline.
You don't have to repeat that.
Sorry. We're all friends. We're all friends here. You don't know what you want to do, right? But and then you went into advertising and foreign service. But one of the things I loved in your book.
So I did detour and go to Moscow for that language study and so forth.
But I love the black waitress apron that you've taken with you all around the world. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about that, what that represented to you as you were early days forming your career and your plans.
Yeah. So it goes back even further. So the child of immigrants who grew up during World War II, we were never allowed to leave the table without finishing everything on our plate. We were never allowed to throw anything away because you might need it later, you might not be able to get it later. And this was pre-COVID. This was all during my growing up period where, the habits that were formed during World War II were life-saving for those people who managed to live through World War II. And I think, I'm not unique in having these weird habits, even though I did not live through World War II, but my parents really instilled in me those habits. And there's just the insecurity of being, my parents were refugees, we didn't have much materially, and so you just never know when things are going to change. And my parents always said, you need to hope for the best, but you need to prepare for the worst. So I, along with a very generous scholarship to Princeton and Pell Grants and, various other things, but that wasn't enough to live on. And so I waitressed my way through Princeton. That was very unusual, I must say. And then afterwards, when I was looking for a job in Manhattan, I went back to waitressing. And, in the beginning of my career as a waitress, I got this little black apron, the half apron with a pocket so you could put your change, back in the days when we used cash, and the notepad and the pen when, we didn't use electronic kind of a medium. So I had this little black apron, and I took it from various waitressing jobs. In the summers I would go back to Connecticut and waitress in restaurants there. And when I joined the Foreign Service in Manhattan, by this time I had been 3 years in a real job in marketing, and now I was joining the government. That's pretty secure generally. And so I was packing everything up in New York City, and I came across the black apron, and I thought, I don't really need this anymore. And then I thought, well, just in case, I'll bring it along in case this Foreign Service gig doesn't work out. And, through multiple moves, Foreign Service officers move every 2 or 3 years. Through multiple moves, I made that same decision every time. And I still have that apron, because you never know in retirement, what if the pension doesn't come through? You just never know. And so I still have that black waitress apron. And so what does it represent to me? I think it represents the security that if things go wrong, I can still fall back on myself and on hard work. You can always rely on yourself and that, the ability to work and get things done and make it happen. And I've never been afraid of hard work, and of persistence. And I think that's what that apron represents to me, that, things may go bad, but you still have yourself to fall back on.
So 3 ambassadorships. It followed you. Let's talk about your parents, who just seem
amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Right? Their stories, their commitment, your love and dutiful care for them. But you write, when I was in a jam, whether it was policy or personnel, I would often think back to my childhood and ask, what would Mama or Papa do? And you wrote, in your decision to testify eventually in the impeachment trials, it's what your father would have done. What channel that for us? What is it about them that so prepared you and informed you, guided you for these hard decisions?
Well, I think that, they were not famous people. They were not people you're going to read about in a book, except my book. They were ordinary in many ways, but they also lived extraordinary lives in extraordinary times. I mean, just surviving from the journey from Europe to North America to finally, Kent, Connecticut, and then thriving in the United States. They came in their, as middle-aged adults. That's really difficult. My father didn't speak English well, and I can see some of you nodding. That's really difficult. And yet they were able to thrive in every environment and able to live their own best lives according to their beliefs and who they were. And I think that integrity really matters. Are we being... sounded like a fire alarm.
It's kind of a cool cell phone, I think.
It's important to live a life of integrity, I think, no matter who you are. And they really instilled that in my brother and myself. And so when I had challenges during my career and in my personal life as well, you go back to, who are you really and what is most important and what will allow you to, wake up in the morning and still be able to live with yourself. I think that's really critical, and my parents were, the best guiding lights for that.
Right. It's lovely. Going back a bit to your broader book and your story, you write, "Mine is not a story of someone who is somehow stronger or more courageous than other people. It is of someone who is frankly ordinary, but who dug deep and met a challenge just as most Americans would do in similar circumstances." With respect, Madam Ambassador, these were not extraordinary, these were extraordinary circumstances you were called upon to do. You had to dig very deep. And was that your parents as well that you drew?
It really was. So that was specifically written about, deciding to testify in the first impeachment of former President Trump, something that I didn't really want to do, to tell you the truth. But I found that, when I was caught between a Republican administration, the people, I worked in the executive branch, so this was the impeachment of my, big boss, and a Democratic House. That was a very difficult position to be in. But, as I thought about it, it was, I was, quite frankly, in a difficult spot because you may recall that I had been recalled from Ukraine in the spring. And then in the summer, President Trump had what he called the perfect phone call. And the transcript of that call was released in September. And that's when I found out what was in it. And so the world focused on the trade for, dirt on Joe Biden and his son, in exchange for javelins. What I focused on was that the two presidents talked about me. It's very unusual for two presidents to talk about an ambassador, especially an ambassador who is no longer even at post.
Right.
And what President Trump said a number of things, but the one thing that really caught my ear was, she's going to go through some things. And I thought, well, what could that be? He's already fired me. And so, my mind went wild in terms of what the possible consequence, what he was thinking I would be going through next and what the consequences would be for me testifying. But as I thought about the situation that I was being put in, it is the job of Congress. One of the foremost responsibilities is oversight of the executive branch. Congress is a co-equal branch with the executive branch. This was a process that was foreseen in the Constitution. There was, everything was unusual about it, but there was nothing unusual about this. And so for the administration to bar administration officials from testifying, in my opinion, was wrong. And so in the end, because I was caught, kind of between two responsibilities, shall we say, I had to do what I thought was right, and I thought it was right to testify, and so I decided to do that. But I do believe, I stand by the words that I wrote, that I think most people would do what I did, and I'll tell you why I think that. I was not the only person called to testify. There were, I think, something like 18 or 19 people called to testify, and every single Foreign Service officer, civil servant, and military person testified. And it was, I was, kind of in a unique position because I was so high profile at that moment in time, but I'm sure it was not easy for anybody. And so that's why I think that, people, for the most part, not everybody, for the most part, when called upon, will do the right thing.
One more question about you, if I may, and then we'll turn to. You write quite a bit. You reference yourself as an introvert.
Yes.
You've been an ambassador 3 times, which is a very unusual distinction that you have in our foreign service. Very public roles. You write that you've had to stand up and greet military parades and dinners, and yet as a self-described introvert. Yet for many, I think, who've read your book or know your role, I went back and looked at how you're described frequently. A defiant truth teller, ready to cross swords with the powerful, harboring no doubts. You have a dolphin named for you.
Yes. That's the best, can I just say?
You have dogs named for you. You were featured in an SNL skit. You're called a badass, which is kind of nice. But you're an introvert. How do you called the whole moment a Kafkaesque experience, right? Like in a movie, and you wouldn't believe it, but it was your life. How is that dimension for you, and how did you summon your dread of testifying, but even separate from the impeachment trial, just your role in the Foreign Service, a very external, public-facing role, given how you self-describe yourself?
Yeah. Well, I actually am an introvert, maybe not tonight, but I am an introvert. And I think, all of us are, on the spectrum of introversion and extroversion. And certainly over time, one learns coping mechanisms. So if I'm at a big event, a reception, or at your house, for example, I don't try to meet everybody. I try to have sort of more in-depth conversations with 1 or 2 people. That's my way of coping with so many people. So I think one learns how to manage these things. But the publicity that came with in anticipation of, and then the actual testimony itself, and then the aftermath, was not anything I had ever experienced before.
Right.
Because despite the kind of the big title of ambassador, plenipotentiary, et cetera, and being called Your Excellency, which always sent my brother into absolute fits of laughter. He never called me that. We're not well known in the United States. We may be in the country that we're assigned to, but certainly not in Washington, D.C. And so that was a completely different dimension, and was a challenge for me to deal with, to be stopped on the street and to, to be kind of a public persona. But then, even though COVID was a terrible trauma for the nation and everything else, but it helped me because, I could sort of retreat. And then I changed my look. And that really helped because nobody recognizes me now. Going incognito has its blessings.
Well, Your Excellency, let me, let's turn to some other challenges, because in many ways you were at the State Department in kind of post-Cold War times, with very few women, right? Many of your experience, when you were in Somalia, you were considered an honorary male.
Yeah.
You've had these kind of experiences with sexism in the State Department. You also served 3 female secretaries of state, Condoleezza Rice, Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton. As a young woman going into the Foreign Service and then serving 3 times as ambassador, talk to us about the gender dimension of diplomacy in your experience and what your takeaways were from this.
Yeah, so, it's interesting. When I wrote the book, I wasn't quite sure how to approach this question. Do I kind of put it out there or do I sort of ignore it? But my female friends of my generation were adamant that I had to put it in there. And what's interesting is we hadn't really discussed any of the experiences that we'd had of, male bosses telling us, you women, you can't be a real Foreign Service officer. Why? Because we're women. Things like that, were kind of, men, sorry to the men in the room, felt free to say things like that and a lot worse. And we didn't talk about it amongst ourselves. I mean, I think that we tried to, to sort of absorb it and ignore it and just through dint of hard work and good attitude, make up for the fact that we were female and continue on our careers in that way. And I would say that, both what was going on at the State Department as well as the way we handled that challenge of being females in basically an all-male profession was not different from the challenges that were faced in American society at large. Because, we reflect, we in the State Department, we in the military, we reflect American society. So that was, it was a real challenge, I think, in my early years. And Madeleine Albright, the first Secretary of State, female Secretary of State, she wasn't appointed until the late 90s. I came in 1986, and there weren't really any, there were some females that were ahead of me, but there weren't kind of the role models where you look at a Hillary Clinton or a Madeleine Albright and model yourself after them. And in fact, one of the things I comment on, and this is not just a book about fashion, black aprons, and what I wore, but women back in the day, in the 1980s, we modeled what we wore, these boxy suits, sort of a fake tie with kind of this flowing scarf-like thing at our neck. We modeled ourselves after what men wore because those were the role models. If you were looking at, what is it to be a successful diplomat, you were looking at men. And so we, wore clothes that were a little, not very feminine, shall I say. And one of the biggest kind of learning moments for me was when I went to London, and I ended up working in the front office, working directly for 3 different ambassadors. They were all male, but they were all completely different, and they were very successful. And that taught me, as a relatively junior officer, that I could be me and still be successful. And that was a really important lesson. I didn't fully absorb it for a number of years, but that was a really important lesson that even among the men, they were different in how they became successful, and that people responded to their genuine nature. And that is, at least in huge part, why they were successful. I think back in the day, we didn't talk about mentorships. We didn't talk, that was just not in the vocabulary. We didn't talk about role models. Although, looking back, I see that people were out there, creating opportunities for me, reaching out a helping hand. I was kind of oblivious, but it was clearly there, and there were role models, male role models for me to follow in terms of how things can be done. But the importance of role models, I just want to tell you one kind of funny story from Ukraine, from the other point of view. So we talk about the importance of role models for women, but I think it's also true for men. So when I was in Ukraine the second time as ambassador, I was talking to a young woman who was the wife of a Foreign Service officer, and she said, "You'll never guess what her 5-year-old son had told her, over breakfast a couple of days ago." I guess they were talking about me, and then he asked her whether boys could be ambassadors too. So, he was just little. He was only 5 years old.
That's good.
He was at the embassy. He'd only seen, a woman in that job, and so he thought maybe that was a job reserved for women.
That's great.
And so I think that really puts it into perspective that we do need role models to, if you can see it, you can be it, and that really, I think, is very true.
So that experience with the 3 ambassadors in London, it showed that was liberating then.
Very.
Right. I think that's what you wrote in that kind of frame, that seeing that you could try, rather than to pretend to be something
Yeah.
you weren't, you saw models of leadership, models of styles, and that's interesting. And that took you through.
Yeah.
Well, let us turn to kind of news of the day in Ukraine. And obviously, we're so fortunate to have you here. There have been many conversations on campus as we go into this second year. But having been DCM and ambassador, you're uniquely poised to talk to us about current events. Let me start with what is at stake for Americans, for the United States, in terms of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and it's for American audiences, I think it's the most important question because we have a lot of domestic priorities. And we have, Russia is not the only issue out there. There's China, there's transnational threats. I mean, the list goes on. And so why focus so much attention on this war of aggression against Ukraine? Why provide so much assistance for Ukraine? And there's no question that the war in Ukraine is about Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has made clear through his writings, through his recent rhetoric, but also through his actions over the years, that he does not believe that that Ukraine is a separate and distinct country, that the people of Ukraine are real people, that they are really Russian, that there is a separate language, that there is a separate culture. And he has, over the years, whether it was in Georgia in 2008, where he took 2 chunks of Georgia, and the international community, including the United States, did very little, no sanctions, some sort of tut-tutting, but that was kind of it. Then in 2014, where we did have sanctions, but they were not sufficiently strong in order to deter Putin from coming to the peace table and actually negotiating a real peace. There was a process for a ceasefire, but Russia never actually implemented any of the things that it was supposed to do. And it continued the war in Ukraine at a low level. But when I say low level, 3 or 4 people died every week. Soldiers, people in communities on the front lines. That's not low level to those families, and it certainly wasn't low level to the country of Ukraine. But it was kind of tolerated. And so Putin was using the time between 2014 and 2022 to regroup. He thought he had the best military in the world, and he finally decided that February 24th, 2022 was the right moment to launch a full-on invasion of Ukraine. And so the war is about Ukraine. It's very clear because of the, really remarkable act of the intelligence community of declassifying not only what Putin was doing, but what his intentions were, which is really, really critical. And so the world knew, Ukraine knew, Russia knew. And it put them on a back foot, but nevertheless, he continued with his plan. And so we know that he wanted to roll into Kyiv, decapitate the administration, and install a puppet government. And he wanted to do that really quickly, thought he could do it in several days or a week. That didn't turn out to be true because of 3 miscalculations. His military wasn't as good as he thought it was. The Ukrainian people actually turned out to be a real people that were going to fight back. And he underestimated the West. He underestimated the leadership that the Biden administration brought to this, and that the Western community would support Ukraine as strongly as it has. So it definitely is about Ukraine. Putin wants to reinstate the empire, whether it's the Russian Empire you're thinking about or the Soviet Empire. He has said he wants to gather the historically Russian lands. And if you look at what that map might look like, it also includes part of NATO, which would be an even bigger problem for the United States. And part of what he is also doing with this war on Ukraine is to undermine the international legal rules-based order. And so that is a really wonky term for the institutions, the legal infrastructure, and the expectations that countries, including the Soviet Union, established in the aftermath of World War II, so 1945 and going forward, because it was never to happen again, that kind of a big war in Europe. And it has, you know, I mean, those institutions need updating, shall we say? They need reform to reflect, you know, the world of 2022 rather than the world of 1945, and to better kind of position those institutions to handle the challenges that we have today. But it is still better than nothing. And if Vladimir Putin succeeds in absorbing Ukraine and making it part of Russia, he will signal to the rest of the world that the West doesn't care enough to fight for the principles that you should not be invading another country. The West is weak, and that he is capable of doing this again, and other totalitarian leaders are going to take that same message. So, you know, I hear a lot that we should be paying, you know, we should, you know, get this war over with in Russia, you know, force the Ukrainians to some sort of settlement because China is the big threat. But my view is that China may be the bigger threat to the United States in the long run, but if the war in Ukraine is not settled in a way that China understands that we mean business, China is going to take the wrong lessons from the war in Ukraine, which is exactly what Russia has been doing in, you know, from 2008 to 2014, and that's why we, in my opinion, it's part of the reason that we are where we are in 2022, because we did not act forcefully enough during those previous wars. So that's why it's important for us. This is about our national security. I mean, yes, we are good people, and we want to help a fellow democracy against an autocracy, but it's the bottom line is that it is better for the United States to stop Russia and Ukraine than to have to stop it later at some time that may not be of our choosing and may not be to our advantage. And so, you know, as so often happens, President Zelensky, I think, said it best when he was addressing Congress back in December, and he said, you know, U.S. assistance, grateful as I am for this, is not a charity. U.S. assistance is an investment in your national security and in the national security of the world.
The domestic dividend. Yeah. I have one more question, then we can go out to the audience with questions. So given what you said, I'm just wondering, is the U.S. doing enough?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is I think the Biden administration is doing a very good job. And I think, you know, if we had this conversation a year ago, we could never have imagined all of the assistance that we and other countries have provided to Ukraine. We just, it wasn't even on our horizon. So the first thing I would say is I think the leadership of the Biden administration, the, you know, really the leadership of the military in terms of working cooperatively with Ukraine, but also with other Western allies and partners to find the systems that the Ukrainians need, the speed with which it has gotten over there, because, you know, some of these things, I mean, I'm sitting here in retirement, you know, these would have, back in the day, these would have been projects that would have taken 2 to 3 years, you know, the discussion over whether to send it, and then the actual physical sending of these enormous systems. But, you know, they're getting over there lickety-split. But here's the but. It's not enough, and it's not fast enough. And so we need to find ways to send more ammunition. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition of all different kinds. And so we need to find ways to send more ammunition faster. We need to provide more air defenses to protect not only the military targets, but also the civilian targets that have been so devastated since the October attacks began. And just yesterday, there were 81 separate missile attacks on Ukraine, if you can imagine that, 81. And they are terrifying to live through. And then the long-range fires. This is an artillery war, and they need longer-range fires to be able to get the Russian supplies where they are now, because the Russians just keep on pulling them back further and further and further, just out of range from what the Ukrainians can hit. Tanks and maybe airplanes. I mean, that's not on the table yet, but maybe that will come later. The other thing that we don't talk about as much is the economic support, because this is an economy that is on life support, as you can imagine, with this devastating war. And we, the IFES, the EU, are providing a lot of assistance, and that is necessary. And then the humanitarian support. I mean, 14 million refugees and internally displaced people in Ukraine. I mean, can you imagine 14 million? That's a lot of people, a lot of disruption, and a lot of need. And so we are doing a lot. I think we need to do more in order to help Ukraine, but also, frankly, to help ourselves.
And how will we know success? How do you?
Well, that is a very good question. I think, President Biden has said that, it's up to Ukraine to decide this, and it's up to Ukraine to decide when they are ready to come to the negotiating table. Right now, Ukraine is not ready. They want to be in a better position on the battlefield, because that will determine what they can demand in peace talks. Russia, despite its rhetoric, is also not ready. I mean, the way I know that is by their actions. 81 missile attacks yesterday. And all sorts of atrocities on the ground. So I think that neither side is really ready, and you need parties that are ready to talk to each other in order to have successful negotiations. What President Zelensky has said is that not an inch of Ukrainian soil goes to Russia, and that includes Crimea.
Right.
And he's got I don't want to say 100%, but it's practically 100% backing of the Ukrainian people on that.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and one of the things that Putin just does not understand is that Ukraine is a democracy. Even if Zelensky were ready to negotiate tomorrow and give away the farm, he wouldn't be president for much longer, because Ukraine is a democracy, and the people are committed 150% to this fight, even though they are suffering and taking huge losses on the battlefield. So the challenge, I think, as hopefully in the next 6 weeks to 6 months, Ukraine will have a better position on the battlefield. And, I'm getting very positive, things change up and down, but right now we're getting some positive reports from the front lines with regard to Ukraine. And so I'm hoping that there will be some Ukrainian gains, and that will enable negotiations sooner rather than later, because one of the things my Ukrainian friends asked me is, we know we're going to win. I mean, they are courageous, they are committed, they are confident they're going to win, but at what price?
Yeah.
At what price?
Yeah.
And so the sooner they can, stop Russia, the sooner they can get to negotiations, the better off Ukraine will be, and everybody else will be as well.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And can I just say one other
Please.
thing? I think in a democracy, the challenge for Zelensky is going to be, if he makes compromises, and I think most of us know that negotiations usually require some sort of compromise. You don't get 100% of everything you want. Although I think the Ukrainians, and I think many in the West, certainly in the United States, are firm that Russia should not be rewarded for its aggression as it was in Georgia and in Ukraine 2014. But he's going to have to bring the Ukrainian people along. Putin doesn't have to worry about that. He can just tell the Russian people, this is what happened, and it was a huge victory for me. Zelensky is in a different position, and he is an amazing leader in terms of how he is leading the Ukrainian people and communicating to them and to the world. I mean, this is a guy who every night he addresses the Ukrainian people. Every night. It is astonishing. He's leading them, but he is also reflecting their will. And there is this dynamic, I don't know if it's a tension or relationship between Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. So he will have to bring them along in whatever these negotiations end up being. And that's, I think, going to be a challenge.
Well, let's go out to questions. I was thinking of your point about the Ukrainian inspiration and unity. It's really,
Yeah.
I was reading about the noted political philosopher Chris Rock, the comedian, who makes this point of the division in the United States. He said,
Yeah.
Ukraine is thoroughly united.
Yeah.
If the Russians invaded the United States, we would not be as united. Some would say, well, let's hear them out first. It's humor, but he's making your point of this
Point, yeah.
phenomenal. Anyway, we have some questions from the audience. We have roving microphones, and Kate Equinazi, a Hobart William Smith Senior, who's been accepted into the Peace Corps
All right.
to serve in Morocco.
The real ambassadors
The
of the
real
United
ambassador. She joins Horithik, who's going. Let's get all the Peace Corps volunteers standing up here. Horithik, stand up. Where's Johanna? There you are. Where's Sam? Sam? 1, 2, 3, 4. How about return Peace Corps volunteers, those who've already served in the Peace Corps? Professor Salter, where are you? Come on. There you go.
All right.
All right. I've done my Peace Corps
I can see.
advertisement here.
Hello. Just want to again thank you for coming to the college and giving your talk. My name is Jackson Gellert. I'm a second year here. And you mentioned that there were 3 main reasons why the Russian invasion of Ukraine has failed so far: the overconfidence of the Russian military, the will of the people to fight, and the will of the West to help Ukraine. Do you think that all those factors play an equal role, or do you think that one of those factors plays a higher role in why Ukraine's done so well thus far?
That's a really good question, and I think, so I'm going to punt. The short answer is I don't know, but I think it's probably going to be studied for, not just years, but decades to come, because at least so far, it's been a spectacular failure for Russia. And what my military colleagues tell me, there's no real path for Russia to succeed militarily. I have to say that I do think it's I think all 3 are really important, because, with a poorly equipped, poorly trained, inferior military like the Russian military has turned out to be, they could have marched into Kyiv if Zelensky and the Ukrainian military hadn't stood up, if Zelensky had listened to the foreign community, the international community, and run away. But the Ukrainian people resisted. The Ukrainian military was much more competent than anybody had imagined, except for maybe some of the people who, actually had worked with the Ukrainian military or were there at the time and knew what the Ukrainian military was capable of. And I think that, the center of gravity is clearly, in other words, the most important thing is clearly Ukraine, and Ukraine's will, as reflected in pretty much everybody in Ukrainian society. I was there in September, and I was just there again, actually, 2 weeks ago. And in September, I really noticed a difference in Ukraine. Everybody in that society is mobilized. They are united, as you noted, and courageous and committed. And everybody is doing what needs to be done. Not because Zelensky or the mayor or somebody has told them, you need to set up a food kitchen here because people really are having problems with finding enough to eat, or you need to be driving an ambulance, because they see it needs to be done, and so people just step up and do it. And that is something that I don't think Putin or the Russians really understand, that, that dynamism of, we are going to work together to do whatever needs to be done to win this fight. So the center of gravity, the most important thing, is definitely with Ukraine and the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people. But they can't do it alone. They can't do it without Western help. I mean, if we stopped military shipments, it would be really tough. It would be really tough for Ukraine to continue. Because as I said, they don't have the long-range fires. They don't have enough ammunition to last more than, I don't know how many more weeks. Without our help, becomes a very, very difficult task for Ukraine to win. So I can't pick one of the three. I think all three are pretty important.
Okay, microphone right over.
Thank you for visiting HWS, Madam Ambassador. My question concerns the potential economic motivations behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Do you believe Ukrainians' lithium reserves play a role in Vladimir Putin's strategy? The New York Times recently wrote an article about this subject, as lithium plays a crucial role in the modern economy. By the way, my name is Daniel Anselmi, and I'm a junior here at the colleges.
Hi, Daniel. I mean, it's possible. Ukraine is a relatively resource-rich country, and it's not just lithium. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lithium. There are other minerals that are in Ukraine, and then there's the famous what they call the black soil, which is so fertile and has provided the agricultural needs not just for Europe but for much of the world for many decades. So there's a lot of economic reasons to want to take over a country like Ukraine, but I really think it's about Putin's ambitions for empire. Russia is an historically expansionistic country over the centuries, and I think Putin wants to, like I said before, gather up those lands, bring them back to Mother Russia, and control them. And I think the other reason is deeply personal for him. I think he wants to seal his place in history. He wants to be the next Peter the Great. I mean, famously, he has a portrait of Peter the Great in his office, and he refers to this. So it's not subtle. This is what he wants to do. I think he will seal his role in history, but not in the way that he had imagined.
Interesting. I think the microphone is on its way.
Oh, sorry.
I thought you were going. Welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. My name's Ed Schultz. I live locally. I have a granddaughter who's a senior here at Hobart William Smith. I wonder if you have any insight into how the United Nations might play a bigger role both in negotiations and sanctions against Russia and help with Ukraine.
Yeah. So that is a really good question. And, I think many of us believe that the United Nations needs to be reformed, to reflect the world we have today as well as to meet the challenges of today. So the Security Council is usually the engine of many things at the UN, but Russia is on the Security Council, as of course you know, and so is China. And that creates a real institutional problem because you can't move anything out of the Security Council because Russia will veto, and Russia has veto powers. And I hadn't realized this until today, but in April, there's a rotating chairmanship of the Security Council, and in April, Russia will take over the chairmanship. So that is going to be, I cannot even imagine what a disaster that is going to be. Yeah, I'm sure we can expect all sorts of unwelcome surprises. So, so the Security Council is a real challenge. And in the General Assembly, which is all of the countries, we and the West have moved the votes on Russia's invasion and actions to the General Assembly and gotten some good support from the General Assembly. But it's mostly been statements condemning the invasion and so forth. And here's what I would say. Not every country has, joined in that condemnation. And more broadly, outside of the UN, there are many countries that, have not joined the sanctions regime and are in fact benefiting from the loopholes that can be used in the sanctions. So as quickly as loopholes develop, we in the West are trying to patch them up and, slap on new sanctions, slap on secondary sanctions, et cetera. But it's, sanctions are a long-term kind of a tool. And we've never sanctioned an economy as big as Russia's, nor a country as powerful as Russia. And so it's been a challenge. And I think this year is the year sort of implementation and trying to, patch those loopholes and, eliminate them. But it's still a real challenge. And I think that while we celebrate, and you've heard me celebrate it a couple of times, that the West has really stood united behind Ukraine and really put its money where its mouth is in ways that I would not necessarily have predicted a year ago. But there are many countries in what we loosely call the global South who do not see this as their fight, who do not seem to understand that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, that there are countries in their part of the world, wherever that might be, that might want to take out little countries because they can and because they believe that they can do it with impunity. That this is not just, a fight in Europe that is distracting the world from whether it's transnational issues like the environment or their particular issues in their particular country. But this is something that is important to everybody. And so I think one of the challenges of our diplomacy has to be, and it's quite clear to me that the Ukrainians understand that it's a challenge for their diplomacy. We all together have to make the case to, not only to our own publics, but to publics in other countries as well, why this war matters to them, why this war is different. I think we're only just beginning really to start that conversation. So I wish I had a more optimistic assessment for you at this time about the UN. I know that Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is our permanent representative at the UN, is fighting this day and night, and she has a more positive outlook that the UN is really doing important things on Ukraine-Russia issues as well as in other parts of the world. But I do think that we need some reforms and as quickly as possible.
Take one more question right here.
Hello.
Thank you. My name is Ken Camera. I'm a local, and I graduated from Hobart a long time ago. I don't know how exactly to say this, but I wonder if you could tell us maybe a little bit of like the inside story about how you and your colleagues felt when the idiot won in his election back in 2016, because you all probably had some misgivings that this person might have a chance to be the President of the United States. And I just, I guess the way I contented myself over the last, those 4 years was there's institutional lethargy. You're all colleagues. You've worked together for the greater good. And now you have this person who is clueless. I wonder, how did you and your colleagues work until you were told to get out to moderate and head off some of the, keep things under control? So I wondered if, I hope it's not an inappropriate question.
So I think this is one of the challenges for Foreign Service officers as well as for career civil servants, that we stay in our jobs. Administrations, come and then they go. They could
You
be
served 5 administrations,
Yeah,
Republicans
that's right.
and Democrats.
Right. And I was appointed as ambassador twice by Republicans and once by a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
So, we remain on the job. And it is our job to serve loyally the president and that administration. And so I worked very hard at the embassy in Kyiv to keep everything as professional as possible, not to talk about politics, because once you go down that road in a government setting, there's no going back, and people are not going to understand that you are, there has to be one foreign policy. There can't be the president's foreign policy and then 150 ambassadors each have their own foreign policy. There has to be one foreign policy. So I'll take you back to, sort of my conversations with myself as to what I would do if Donald Trump won, because he had made some comments, even as a candidate, about Russia, about Crimea not really being Ukrainian, et cetera, about NATO and not believing in the worth of NATO, about all sorts of things, and foreign assistance and wanting to cut foreign assistance. All of those issues cut to the core of, my job as ambassador, and I had just gotten to Ukraine. My job as ambassador. But, I kind of had a conversation with myself as to whether or not I could serve President Trump. Because, you're the ambassador, you're the face of that country and the face of that administration. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, let's see what he does, first and foremost. Because naively, I thought that since there had been basically a foreign policy consensus with regard to Ukraine since independence in 1991, where both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations all supported Ukraine. And they supported Ukraine especially after 2014 and the first Russian invasion, and that was continuing. And so I thought that the sort of the Republican establishment would, kind of take on the new president, take him under his wing, and explain why these things are important, why NATO is important, and so forth. So, there was the wait and see how it actually turns out. And then there was also, I was nearing the end of my career, and so I had a lot of latitude. I could retire the following day. But the people who worked for me, they didn't have that ability. Most of them were much younger, they had families. And so I thought, well, I can be the buffer between, whatever political headwinds come our way and, the people who work for me. I mean, I think that leadership has responsibilities as well as, the privilege of being a leader and the glory of being a leader. It also means, taking on some of the harder things as well. And I thought I could make a difference. I thought that, I knew Ukraine very well, I knew the situation very well, and that I could explain to the new administration why certain things are important and so forth. And pretty early on in the Trump administration, there was an interagency meeting at a relatively high level, and the policy was set, and I don't know whether President Trump knew this or not, but it was basically the same, the same policy as President Obama had before. And, but it was now, President Trump's policy. This was agreed. And he actually, in my opinion, strengthened the policy because, under, some arm twisting from senior members of his administration, but nevertheless, he agreed to sell javelins, or to provide javelins to Ukraine at the end of 2017, and they got there in 2018. That was important. It was more important symbolically, honestly, because by that point, at that point, it was not a tank war. It has since become a tank war. But it was important symbolically, and so he strengthened that policy. And so when I was thinking about, what do I do, as ambassador in Ukraine, I felt that I could continue to make a difference, and I didn't have to resign. But I always wondered whether one day I would have to resign. But, in terms of leading the embassy, I tried to keep it as apolitical as possible. While, President Trump, even though we had this policy, he would nevertheless sometimes make tweets or statements that were not in agreement with his own policy. And so, we would have to address them in terms of public affairs, in terms of reassuring the Ukrainian government. And so I tried to, just state the facts. This is what happened. And so this is, the plan of action that we're going to take and how we're going to manage this without, making, my own personal views, kind of known or any discussion of that. And I would also say that embassies are not monoliths. I'm sure that there were a lot of Democrats who supported Hillary Clinton and wanted her to be president, but there were also a lot of Republicans and people who wanted Donald Trump to be president and who were pleased when he became president. And so again, in that kind of a setting, it would have been inappropriate for me to be political. I mean, it's just not what we are supposed to do, and I really tried to adhere to that.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I think certainly having worked in government and seen the vital role of Foreign Service officers from my lens and the White House staff who were in the Peace Corps, you really honored that kind of bridging of those, and your book really speaks powerfully to that.
Thank you.
Our mission here at Hobart and William Smith is to prepare students to lead a life of consequence, right? A life of purpose.
Yeah.
And part of the time on the campus is for students to interrogate that. But I think today they have a model of a life of consequence, of the life you've led, the service you've given to our nation. I commend everyone to read the ambassador's book. She's generously given some time with classes here and student groups, and I'm certainly grateful to our faculty colleagues, Professor Philbert Gaddov and Christian Welsh, and to Jim Anderson, the Hobart class of '65, who really visioned and put together this very important inaugural convening and forum. So join me in thanking the ambassador for it.
Thank you. Thank you.